Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Anna Akhmatova's poem Requiem, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So Akhmatova was one of the most important and influential of the modernist. She's often called a Russian poet, but she was Russo-Ukrainian. She was part Russian. One side of her family was Russian. One side of her family was Ukrainian. She really came of age as a writer, poet, thinker during the early years of the Soviet Union. Particularly, the Stalinist years were very difficult for her because she was regarded as something of a almost frivolous writer. Certainly she was not doing the kind of social class consciousness, socialist realist work that was the official required style of the Soviet Union, and so she was persecuted. One of her husbands, she was married 3 times, one of her husbands was actually shot by the Soviet government in the early 1920s, and her son, Lev Gumilyov, was arrested. And that's kind of what gave rise to the poem Requiem, which has got an interesting history because originally Akhmatova was not able to write Requiem. It was too dangerous for her, given the scrutiny of her by the Soviet government, to actually write this poem in the late 1930s into 1940 when it was originally composed. And so it actually, I think, wasn't published until like 1966 in a different country. And it wasn't finally published in the Soviet Union until 1987. But what Akhmatova did, along with one of her colleagues, was they memorized the sections of the poem so that while they couldn't write it down, they could preserve the poem. And basically, the gist of Requiem is that it explores the experience of this group of women waiting outside the, I think it's called the Kresty prison. I can't remember exactly what the name of the prison was where her son was imprisoned. And I can't find it just at the moment. But basically, Kresty prison. So basically, this group of women would come every day hoping that they would be allowed to see or at least pass a letter or a package or something to the people that they knew who were imprisoned there. And Akhmatova spent years waiting with these women, hoping to see her son, Lev Gumilyov. And the other aspect of this for these women was this deep and abiding dread that one day they would get news that their loved one had been sentenced to execution or exiled to Siberia or whatever it was. And so there was this sort of suspended animation that these women experienced. And this is what gives rise to Requiem. We see this really kind of explained from the beginning, because we have this section instead of a preface. So we have a little epigraph here at the beginning, and then we have, instead of a preface, we have a dedication, and we have a prologue. I'm actually going to probably end up reading a lot of Requiem to you because there's so many interesting bits and pieces to it. So instead of a preface, what it says here is, in the terrible years of the Yezhov terror, and that refers to Nikolai Yezhov, who was head of Soviet secret police from 1937 to 38, which was a period of significant mass arrests. In the terrible years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months in the prison lines of Leningrad. Once someone recognized me. Then a woman with bluish lips standing behind me, who of course had never heard me called by name before, woke up from the stupor to which everyone had succumbed and whispered in my ear. Everyone spoke in whispers there. Can you describe this? And I answered, yes, I can. Then something that looked like a smile passed over what had once been her face. And that dedication, or that instead of a preface, was written April 1st, 1957. So this is looking back on this poem and contextualizing it. So that's sort of the idea here, right? Is as with most traumatic or significant historical events, the majority of the people involved in them, the majority of the people impacted by them, do not have the command of language to accurately reflect what this experience is. And so Akhmatova, with Requiem, sets out to basically represent that experience, represent the suffering of these women, of whom she was one. So the next part I want to read you is the prologue, which says, "That was when the ones who smiled were the dead, glad to be at rest, and like a useless appendage Leningrad swung from its prisons. And when, senseless from torment, regiments of convicts marched, and the short songs of farewell were sung by locomotive whistles, the stars of death stood above us, and innocent Russia writhed under the bloody knots and under the tires of the Black Marias." And Black Marias were the secret police cars that were used to take people away. And so, again, we get this pervading sense of doom, this almost tragic sense of the terror that gripped Russia during the Stalinist regime. And this is linked in part one. This is linked to Russian history, the current moment. And this is one of the things Akhmatova really likes to do. She links what's going on in the current experiences to Russian history, Russian folklore, religion and religious ideology, religious imagery, etc., etc. And so the first portion of this, entry one, is actually related to Nikolai Punin, who was Akhmatova's third husband. He was arrested, and so the poem is inspired by that experience of his arrest. "They led you away at dawn. I followed you like a mourner. In the dark front room, the children were crying. By the icon shelf, the candle was dying. On your lips was the icon's chill. The deathly sweat on your brow unforgettable. I will be like the wives of the Streltsy, howling under the Kremlin towers." So we've got a couple of things here that, again, are very indicative of Akhmatova's general approach in Requiem. The reference to the icon and to Punin kissing the icon as he was being taken away. This is a very traditional Russian Orthodox thing. Icons are a big element of Russian Orthodox religion. And so we've got that religious element linked to tragic loss under the authoritarian state. We've also got this reference to the Streltsy, and they were an elite military corps that were also used, I think, often as sort of repressive state apparatus. They were created by Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, and they were finally disbanded by Peter the Great in 1698. And basically, the Streltsy were executed en masse by Peter the Great. Their wives and children and stuff were there. And there are famous Russian paintings of this, the execution of the Streltsy, with Peter the Great sort of. The one that I'm most familiar with has Peter the Great astride a horse, looking very stony-faced and merciless. And the Streltsy with their long beards and traditional Russian clothing, in contrast to Peter's late 17th century modern European dress, and the wives of the Streltsy just looking haggard and in despair. And so the Streltsy are an interesting comparison because on the one hand, they themselves were used as an instrument of state terror. But on the other hand, they were also executed en masse by a state trying to modernize, because that was what Peter the Great did, really, was he dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the modern world of the 17th century. And so they're this interesting evocation for Akhmatova, because on the one hand, they represent the kind of forces that are arresting her husband. On the other hand, they themselves suffered a brutal crackdown. So there's an interesting contradictoriness to Russian history in this context. The next one, number 2, part 2, this is based in the style of a folk song. And the reason that that's significant is because we get this modernist pastiche element really right from the beginning. So you think about poems like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, for instance. This is a pastiche of different styles, different techniques, different religious traditions, different philosophical traditions, etc., all sort of mashed up in a jumble, basically. And so Akhmatova is picking up on that modernist technique of combining different things. So we've gone from we go from these more sort of lyrical, elevated style poems to this kind of folk song. And again, it's about the Russian experience, particularly the experience of this group of women who were hoping for good news from these Stalinist prisons. I'm not going to read you the folk song. It's fine, but that point is the point I wanted to make about it. In part 4, Akhmatova gives us another interesting contrast, another interesting moment, because she contrasts the joy of her youth with the suffering of her adulthood, and she sort of wonders whether or not the joy of youth is somehow poisoned by this. So she says here, "You should have been shown, you mocker, minion of all your friends, gay little sinner of Tsarskoye Selo." That's her. That's where she grew up. Tsarskoye Selo. I'm probably saying that wrong. I apologize. What would happen in your life? How 300th in line with a parcel you'd stand by the Kresty prison, your tempestuous tears burning through New Year's ice. Over there, the prison poplar bends and there's no sound. And over there, how many innocent lives are ending now? And so again, there's this sense of loss, which is very typical of the modernists. We get this. I would think of this particularly with Septimus Smith from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, or with Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. This sense of loss, this sense that once there was joy in the world, and now for one reason or another, that joy has departed. Again, it's a very, very modernist thematic. In section 5, we get another turn toward religious imagery specifically. In this case, apocalyptic imagery drawing from the book of Revelation. So 5 is, "For 17 months I've been crying out, calling you home. I flung myself at the hangman's feet." That's a reference to Stalin. "You are my..." Akhmatova actually wrote to Stalin himself, trying to get a reprieve for her son, which was unsuccessful. "I flung myself at the hangman's feet. You are my son and my horror. Everything is confused forever, and it's not clear to me who is a beast now, who is a man, and how long before the execution. And there are only dusty flowers, and the chinking of the censer, and tracks from somewhere to nowhere. And staring me straight in the eyes, and threatening impending death, is an enormous star." So references like the beast, like the star, these are images taken directly from Revelation. And I think there's this sense, again, she draws on this religious imagery. Russia was traditionally a very, very religious country, Russian Orthodox religion. And then under the Soviet Union, religion was effectively banned. So religious imagery does become a kind of symbol of resistance against the militant secularism of the Soviet Union, but it's also something that a Russian audience is very much going to be familiar with. It's going to be in their minds. They will understand these references, even if officially religion is largely repressed by this point. Number 7, I think, is an interesting one. It's subtitled "The Sentence," and this was written June 22nd, 1939, which was around the time when her son Lev Gumilyov was sentenced to exile in Siberia. And so this is a more, in some ways, personal poem, an individual experience of loss within the framework of the poem's larger concern with a collective experience of loss. And so that adds an additional dimension to that suffering that's at the center of Requiem. Part 10, we've got a multi-part element here, a two-part element here, which is rooted in religious imagery again. And it's particularly the religious imagery of loss and suffering. But it's also, interestingly enough, religious imagery that implies redemption. So it's part 10, subtitled "Crucifixion," with an epigraph, "Do not weep for me, mother, I am in the grave," which comes from a Russian Orthodox service. Then part 1 says, "A choir of angels sang the praises of that momentous hour, and the heavens dissolved in fire. To his father he said, 'Why hast thou forsaken me?' And to his mother, 'Oh, do not weep for me.'" So this is an interesting one because, again, so much of this is about the experience of mothers and the dedication of mothers in this prison waiting line. And then part 2 of this, "Mary Magdalene beat her breast and sobbed, the beloved disciple turned to stone, but where the silent mother stood, there no one glanced and no one would have dared." So the sufferings of mothers are really presented here through this religious imagery, this religious evocation of maternal suffering, the Virgin Mary's suffering during the crucifixion of her son. And one of the things that's interesting, particularly about part 2, is the contrast between Mary Magdalene and the beloved disciple, who no one is 100% sure who he is. The footnote in the Norton Anthology says the Apostle John. There's debate about who exactly the beloved disciple is, but he was one of the disciples, nonetheless. So they both, their grief is very apparent. But the Virgin Mary, she says here, no one glanced, and no one would have dared. Her suffering is on another level here. Like her pain at the loss of her son surpasses the loss of Mary Magdalene, who might very well have been Jesus's wife or lover or whatever it is, passes the grief of the beloved disciple, who might very well have been related to Jesus, maybe a brother, maybe there's some theories that he was even a son. The suffering of the mother here is greater. And again, this is an echo of the experience of these women. And then we have 2 epilogues that end the poem. Epilogue 1 is about this collective experience of suffering, the pain that these women experienced as a group. So it goes like this. I learned how faces fall, how terror darts from under eyelids, how suffering traces lines of stiff cuneiform on cheeks, how locks of ashen blonde or black turn silver suddenly, Smiles fade on submissive lips, and fear trembles in a dry laugh. And I pray not for myself alone, but for all those who stood there with me, in cruel cold and in July's heat, at that blind red wall. So again, this collective experience, shared experience of suffering that's being memorialized in the poem. But this is not the only type of memorialization that Akhmatova is thinking about here, because Epilogue 2 asks the people of Russia to remember, specifically to remember this suffering. So, Epilogue 2 says, once more the day of remembrance draws near. That's in the Russian Orthodox Church, a memorial service held on the anniversary of death, according to the footnote in the Norton Anthology. Once more the day of remembrance draws near. I see, I hear, I feel you. And the one they almost had to drag at the end, and the one who tramps her native land no more, and the one who, tossing her beautiful head, said, coming here's like coming home. I'd like to name them all by name, but the list has been confiscated and is nowhere to be found. I have woven a wide mantle for them from the meager, overheard words. I will remember them always and everywhere. I will never forget them no matter what comes. And if they gag my exhausted mouth, through which 100 million scream, then may the people remember me on the eve of my remembrance day. And if ever in this country they decide to erect a monument to me, I consent to that honor under these conditions, that it stand neither by the sea where I was born, my last tie with the sea is broken, nor in the Tsar's garden near the cherished pine stump, where an inconsolable shade looks for me, but here where I stood for 300 hours, and where they never unbolted the doors for me. Then, lest in blissful death I forget the rumbling of the Black Marias, forget how that detested door slammed shut and an old woman howled like a wounded animal. And may the melting snow stream like tears from my motionless lids of bronze, and a prison dove coo in the distance, and the ships of the Neva sail calmly on. So again, it is this thing that the poem itself is a memorial to what happened, and yet in it, Akhmatova says in this second epilogue, any memorial to me should be a memorial to this suffering, to this experience shared by all of these women, and not just